The sound of flies buzzed thick in the air. That acrid smell of sweat and dried hay hung heavy in the scorching heat. And there she was, a young woman, barely 23, tied to a rough post in a rundown stable on the outskirts of San Angelo, Texas. The ropes bit deep into her wrists, a raw, bloody mess in the relentless sun. One eye was swollen shut, her cheek a deep red from a slap that still seemed to burn. Her white dress was torn, ripped at the shoulder and the hip. She'd been beaten, left to die like some stray animal. The summer of 1890 was pure misery. Dust swirled through the broken walls of the stable, coating her ripped dress and clinging to the sweat on her bruised skin. She was shaking, not just from the pain, but from a gut-wrenching fear that made your chest feel heavy. You could see she'd fought, in the burns on her arms, in the scraped-up knees from trying to stand. But now she just hung there, limp, her breath shallow, her eyes fixed on the doorway like a prayer for anyone to show up. Men of the West knew cruelty. They'd seen hangings, cattle thieves, cold-blooded murders in bars. But this was different. This was the sight of a soul crushed by pure greed and power. It was a picture that would tear a hole in any man, especially one who'd ever had a daughter or loved a woman. The question screamed in the silence. Who could do this, and why? That's when Elias Carter stepped in, a rancher of 51, carrying the full weight of a life of loss and loneliness. He was no stranger to pain. But what he saw in that stable froze him dead in his tracks. The sun seemed to fade. The world shrank to this one horrific image. A girl broken, but still alive. Her eyes were wet, but she just refused to cry. But cutting those ropes? That was only the beginning. The real danger was back at his own ranch. Elias did what any man with a shred of decency would do. He drew his knife, sliced the ropes, and caught Clara before she hit the ground. Her body was frail, shaking like a newborn foal, her skin burning from the Texas sun. He carried her out, laid her gently across his horse, and started the ride back to his ranch. With every beat of his horse's hooves, Elias felt a weight heavier than the girl in his arms. He was in deep, and he knew it. By the time they reached the ranch, the sky had turned the color of a dying fire. Elias brought her inside his small cabin, the smell of wood smoke and leather wrapping around them. He eased her into a chair and went to get her a cup of water from the pump outside. She drank like a woman who'd been starving for days, each sip slow, her lips trembling against the tin cup. Only then did she finally speak. She told him her name, Clara Hayes. She was the daughter of a rancher in Wichita County. Her father owned land, miles of wide, green land that had caught the eye of a man named Grayson. Grayson was a man of money and a vicious temper, the kind of man who thought cash could buy anything. Clara's father said no, and Grayson, not used to that word, sent his men to change his mind. They took Clara, tied her up, beat her, and left her to die. She wasn't the real prize. She was bait, a pawn in a bigger game to break her father's spirit and steal his land. Elias sat there, listening, his jaw hard as a rock. He'd known men like Grayson all his life, men who built empires on fear, who twisted the law to suit themselves. But he also knew this land as Texas dirt, and he knew when it was time to stand your ground. The thought of Clara's father forced to his knees, and Clara herself used as bait, made his blood run cold. Clara's eyes met his from across the table. They were exhausted, bruised and swollen, but inside them a fire still burned. She'd been through pain no one her age should ever have to face, and yet she wasn't broken. Elias felt the air shift. By saving her, he'd stepped into a storm bigger than his own ranch, and there'd be no way back. And as the lamps burned low in that cabin, the sound of footsteps outside told Elias that the storm was already at his door. The night was quiet, too quiet for Texas. Elias knew his land. He knew the sounds of coyotes, the lowing of cattle, the creak of his windmill. But what he heard now was different. Slow boots on the dirt. Someone was outside his cabin. His hand went to the old Colt resting on the table. The door creaked open, and there he was. Luke Hanley, a man with a crooked smile and eyes that held no shame. He was one of Grayson's boys. The kind who didn't ask questions, they just swung their fists and tied their knots. Clara gasped when she saw him, her body stiffening as if the ropes had found her again. Luke leaned against the doorway, too calm for a man caught trespassing. He said he came for the girl, said it as if she was just another piece of property to be herded back. Elias stood up, his jaw set, the Colt in his hand steady. There was a pause, the kind that feels like thunder building on the horizon. Then Clara broke it. Her voice was raw but strong. She screamed a warning to Elias just as Luke lunged. That one shout was all Elias needed. The rancher slammed Luke against the wall. Years of hard work in the fields exploded into raw power. Luke fought, but Elias pinned him down. The fight drained out of him like water through dry sand. When Elias searched him, a thick wad of bills fell to the floor. Fresh money, stamped with the mark of the Wichita County Bank. Bills known to come from Grayson's accounts. It was proof, the kind you don't need a judge to understand. Clara's face went pale. She remembered one of the men laughing as she was tied, saying Grayson was finally going to get what he wanted. Now the pieces fit together. Elias stared down at Luke, the man writhing like a snake caught under a boot. The truth was crystal clear. Clara had been right. She was just a pawn in a land grab that stank of greed and arrogance. Elias felt that old fire rise in his chest. He'd lived a long life, seen men broken by power. But this was different. This was his ranch, his land, his home, now tied to the fate of this young woman. And if you want to ride with us deeper into this storm, smash that subscribe button so you don't miss the moment when Grayson himself steps into the light. Dawn came slowly, a soft light bleeding across the Texas plains. Elias hadn't slept. He sat by the window with his rifle across his knees, watching the line where the land met the sky. Clara was dozing in the chair by the fire, her face pale, but her spirit unbroken. The night had offered them no peace, just the heavy certainty that more trouble was on its way. Then he heard it. Hooves. Not one horse, but several, the sound rolling like distant thunder. Elias stood and looked out. 3 riders were making their way toward the ranch, their shapes growing bigger with every stride of their horses. Each had the swagger of a man who knew he was feared. Clara woke with a jolt when Elias chambered around. She whispered his name, her voice tight. But no words were needed. They both knew this moment was coming. Grayson had sent more men, and they were here to finish what Luke couldn't. The riders dismounted in a cloud of dust, their boots crunching on the dry earth. They carried torches and cans of kerosene, the kind of tools that could turn a ranch into a pile of ash in minutes. One of them yelled for Elias to come out and hand over the girl. It wasn't a request. It was a threat. Elias stepped onto the porch, his rifle steady, his shadow long in the rising sun. He called back, his voice low but sharp, telling them this ranch wasn't theirs to take. The standoff felt like an eternity, the kind of silence that makes your heart pound in your ears. Then all hell broke loose. A torch sailed through the air, landing in a pile of hay. Clara, without a second thought, grabbed a bucket of water and threw it over the flames. At the same moment, Elias squeezed the trigger. The first rider dropped, his torch clattering to the ground. The second rushed forward, pistol drawn, but Elias spun and fired again. The third tried to scramble for cover, but was shocked when Clara hurled a wooden beam at his horse, sending the animal rearing and throwing its rider to the ground. The fight was over as fast as it began. Dust hung heavy in the air. The smell of gunpowder was sharp and bitter. 2 men lay wounded, one of them crawling away into the brush, swearing revenge. Elias stood on the porch, breathing hard, the rifle still warm in his hands. Clara looked at him, her chest heaving, her eyes wide, not with fear but with something far deeper. And while the smoke still lingered, word of the fight was already racing back to town, straight to the man who started it all. By the time Elias dragged Luke Hanley and the wounded men into town, the news was spreading like wildfire. Folks gathered in the street, their eyes sharp and their voices low. When the sheriff saw the packet of bills with Grayson's bank seal and heard Luke curse his boss's name in anger, the last wall of silence came crashing down. People who'd been quiet for years suddenly found their voices. A shopkeeper stepped forward, telling how Grayson had bled him dry with unfair debts. A widow yelled how Grayson's men had driven her from her land. The dam had finally burst. By noon, the entire town was no longer afraid. They marched together to Grayson's fancy house on the hill. He tried to lock the doors, tried to hide behind hired guns, but fear is a flimsy shield when the truth is out. Elias stood with Clara at the edge of the crowd, watching as the people who once bowed their heads now stood tall. Grayson was dragged down his own steps, his fancy coat torn, his face pale. He yelled for order, for respect, but no one was listening anymore. In the West, sometimes justice came with a gavel, but more often it came with the fists of ordinary men and women who had had enough. That day, Grayson lost everything: his power, his pride, and the fear he had used to rule. Only after the dust settled did Henry Hayes arrive with his wagon. His face was a roadmap of sleepless nights, but his eyes lit up when he saw Clara. She ran into his arms, and the sight of father and daughter reunited made even the hardest rancher blink back tears. Henry shook Elias's hand, gripping it tight, a silent thanks between two men who understood sacrifice. Then Clara climbed onto the wagon. She turned, her eyes resting on Elias. They were soft, filled with something more than just gratitude. Elias tipped his hat, a small smile on his lips. He said nothing, but the silence in that moment felt heavier than words. Was it goodbye, or was it the start of something left unsaid? And maybe that's the real lesson here, that justice isn't born from wealth, but from courage. That love doesn't always roar. Sometimes it just waits in the silence. So let me ask you, if you were Elias, would you have spoken your heart before that wagon rolled away? If this story spoke to you, give it a like and subscribe to the channel. More tales of dust, grit, and quiet love are waiting down the road.